Yeah, thanks a lot. It's interesting that you say that EU housing ministers meet for the first time in 30 years. I think 13, yeah. I think I experience a bit the same in within the OECD because the coordination issue when you work on housing at the OECD is probably as complicated as coordinating housing policies across ministries for most governments. Because when you say housing ministers, I think there are very few countries that actually have a ministry for housing or for construction, residential construction. I think that in Germany they tried to create such a ministry for the first time in 30 years. And the last contact that I had last year with them is that they were still looking for offices actually to locate to bring in their people. I mean, yeah, and it's more for labeling issues because it's the same teams actually that came together from the Ministry from the Interior. So you know, for now, it's more a political statement and communication than actual work in the ministry. But I think many countries will tell you, okay, you want me to send the housing minister? I mean, I don't know. There is no housing minister, but someone has it on his head probably. You know, housing. So they send someone, but. Yeah, I think the really important point from a national policy point of view is to streamline responsibilities and also account for different structures like in federal systems like in Austria and in Germany. I think it's particularly complicated because most of the responsibilities lie with the lenders, I guess, or even municipalities, which is an issue. We also created an indicator based on a survey where we ask countries who's actually responsible or who's responsible for land use policies in your country. And depending on the level of government and on the overlap between levels of government, we created a quantitative indicator there. So if you rank high, it's actually bad. So it means like responsibility is on a local level, municipal level, which like then fuels this NIMBYism. And if you have overlaps, then you create red tape and a lot of hindering obstacles to residential land use. So I think, for national policy, it's very important to streamline and communicate efficiently across the ministries and to have maybe someone really in charge. So bringing ministers together could help in this endeavor. And and last but not least, on the social housing, I mean, we don't call it. I mean, sometimes we use the term social housing as well, but we say housing that is rented below market rates. So it's probably coming closest to what Bernd called cost-based housing. Remember the Venn diagram at the beginning that I've shown with the interaction and trade-offs between sustainability, efficiency, and inclusiveness. And there was no single policy recommendations that had not an adverse effect on one of the other dimensions, except for social housing. So we have really identified, independently of my invitations to Vienna by the GBV, social housing is one of the policy tools and means that can actually help across all these dimensions. Efficiency, because it creates supply. So it brings, I mean, hopefully supply where the demand is most needed, where supply is most needed, as measured by the demand. It makes obviously things more inclusive because it helps affordability, and if well implemented, so that's a caveat here. It should also combat segregation. I think there the GBV and the Austrian model is doing an extraordinary job because social housing in Austria, as far as I can see from the indicators and from the things I read, does not spur segregation. So I think that is something that other countries that come up with social housing, they create affordable housing for people, but they also fuel segregation because they build these social housing in ghettos. I mean, Paris is one of those. That's one of the big issues in Paris. And sustainability, as you have mentioned, because they exert peer pressure on the private market. So it's not only that social housing, social buildings seem to have better labeling, I mean, better energy efficiency labels, but they also exert peer pressure on the private market, and that's an important channel, I think. So, yeah.
We welcome Bernd Riesland back to the table as well. So indeed, thank you for that elaboration again on the complexity. So I just look a little bit at what we recommend here. Indeed, provide public housing, affordable housing in areas will benefit from environmental improvements. We also, so the OECD also recommends increasing flexibility of rent regulation, so more balanced and flexible rent rules. They recommend increasing flexibility of regulations, in particular densification, and also updating land value. So maybe, Bernd, you would like to react a little bit to the recommendations, these ones, but also more broadly, if you would like to.
Well, looking back those four interventions, especially by the case of saying that the size and the price of housing even is important of how much children are living in the EU. I think it's very important to step out of the box and have ideas like this to see what is happening. And I'm really coming out of this. I'm really more motivated for shaping housing markets and bring more competition in, because if we look on the macroeconomic level, we look at affordable housing, and is housing not thank you for the distinction between affordable housing and housing affordability. And that is if it's in general, we have the idea in the macroeconomic approach, if it's affordable and we mean middle income, then it's more or less okay. But would we say with the bread price, if the middle income households can afford bread, everything is okay? Putting it into connection, is housing infrastructure, or is it just a market thing? And if we take the Austrian situation, the Austrian analysis, which has much more detail in than was possible to present here, it's roughly 30% lower the price in the limited profit sector. Limited profit sector means there is profit. So it's not as we are not speaking of subsidizations, but of limited profit. And this is actually, we calculated 160 euros per month and unit. If you take this into the European market, you say going down 30% out of the household budget, you reduce the burden for housing around 750 billion to 1,000 billion a year. If you take the Austrian example and just calculate what we got out here in Austria, you calculate up. And that is quite a lot of money for environmental investment. And if you look at the situation, what you described just, if the rent is lower, we have more means for environmental investment. This is a bit of a funny situation as well. No? Profits going down and there is more investment. It's well, it was a bit out of the box, perhaps, but it's a motivation. There should something happen, because 1,000 billion a year, the European Central Bank tried this system over 3 years or 4 years to fuel speculation, you could say, but they put it in the general capital market and not in an investment with purpose. They just brought money in. So I think and I'm very happy that we are here in a combination of different institutions and all thinking in the same way. And with this out of the box, perhaps I bring some motivation, not only to me, but as well to you to continue in this work.
Thanks a lot. Thinking outside the box, indeed. Would other panelists like to make a comment? Yes, Julie?
If we go through the table of the 6 or so recommendations that are on the. I'm getting a sore neck turning around, but I hope you can see them all clearly. Probably the one I'd have the most contentious response to would be the first one, that the idea of more deregulation or flexibility around land is necessarily going to lead to the supply outcomes you desire. And we know from the way in which development decisions are made, it may be certainly beneficial to hold rather than develop at certain times. Depends who is holding. So land banking is a common strategy by the development industry. It can occur for public purpose, or it can occur for a purely speculative purpose. You also have dormant land used by former public agencies, perhaps Defence Department, for example, Post Office. That actually requires not so much deregulation and flexibility, but it actually requires much more purposeful activism, in a way, on the part of a public interest, city government. And you see that in Paris happening with great success in turning around former sites of in central city locations. So I would perhaps there has been an argument kicking around public policy debates in housing that the real problem, the real boogeyman is regulation and planning. But in Australia, for example, we see that there are many permits given to develop housing in recent years, but those permits have not been utilised to develop, not because of the planning isn't there, they have the permission, but simply because they choose not to, because wouldn't maximise profit to develop at that time. So that's actually more so we have many permits issued, but no development. So, I probably take most contention with that. And we have a really nice report that Hanu Ruanavara and I did in 2020, which is about all the different instruments that cities can use to reactivate, mobilise land for a needed purpose. And I think I'd really like to see the OECD get behind that as well. The other issues in terms of policy, I really don't have much to say about. Although I am a bit cautious when we talk about balance and flexibility around rental policies, I actually think that certainty is pretty helpful, both for the landlord and for the tenant. If you have a vision that goes, in 5 years, that can also help smooth turbulence and cycles. And we see the way the German rental market works to moderate price fluctuations, and the Dutch rental market works in the past to promote a better reflection of quality rather than scarcity. So I would suggest that we need a mix of mechanisms to help determine our rents, and price market mechanisms would be the last one I would rely on to responsibly allocate the cost of homes. Yeah.
This is Sorcha. Yeah. So maybe a quick reaction. Thanks for these slides. I think the first point here is a very complex one. So we're going to talk about zoning and land use. There are many dimensions to that. So when you talk about reactivating land to build residential structures on it, that's actually part of it. So we have also a few paragraphs on this. We would summarize the items by land value capture mechanisms. There are a lot of ways actually to force landowners or to incite landowners to actually build structures on the land they own. And when they buy the land, you can actually enforce that it's inclusionary in terms of zoning. So if there are private developers that want to build offices or factories there, they of course mean that a chunk or a share of the land that they buy should be dedicated to residential structures. So a lot of things can be done there. Flexibility, I mean liberal in the sense that just give the land to someone. I mean,
it's also linking it to heating speculation and using lands, because ultimately the goal of this and other recommendations is to advocate densification rather than urban sprawl. I mean, we have a long-standing discussion within the OECD between these two strands, because there is no black and white probably. I mean, the stand of the economics department and the views that I take here are not my own necessarily, but we have decided to go in favor of densification. Maybe not like unlimited densification like you see in Tokyo, but probably more densification than you see in. There was an article in the New York Times that you see in the outskirts of New York, where you have like garden cities, where landowners there, they have huge single home structures and they compete for construction, and it creates clear externalities on the others. At the same time, no one wants to live probably in Tokyo, where there's no green space left, and they don't seem to have an affordability issue. So the New York Times is actually heralding their policies in the sense that they have unlocked supply in a way that needed price increases. So housing is affordable in Tokyo. Is it livable? It's another question.
And zoning and land use policies need to be seen in combination with land value captures and also with property taxation. That's also something we advocate, that you come up with split rate taxation of properties. So you have a higher. Not many countries do that, but it's actually not that difficult to do, probably. So you have to value the land and the structure on it, and you just tax it differently. So land has to be taxed higher than the structure on it, so as to give an incentive basically to landowners to build on the land. So this can help. And on rental regulation, it's also a very tricky issue. I think it's a bit like with housing allowances. There's a short-term effect and an incumbent effect and an outsider long-term effect. So I think in the short run, housing allowances and also rent caps helping the incumbents and help people who suffer and who are vulnerable. But in the long run, it's just a devastation to the supply and to the construction sector. That's the Berlin experience. I'm coming from Berlin, and everything I hear from there in the past few years, the rent caps seem to have destroyed the local construction market. And in the long run, this will not help house prices. It will help maybe those who are incumbents, who are renters, but it will make things even more complicated in the long run. So, I mean, I understand that this discussion is complicated, but it's important to have this balanced view between long-term and short-term, and between incumbents and want to be or would-be renters.
Thank you. Julia, I'll ask you to come back just afterwards, because I think it would be nice to give a reaction time from Michael Klein and Stefan Seidner to the OECD recommendations, and perhaps you would like to take it more from the limited profit Austrian sector. So what?
No, I want to challenge the OECD table. Everyone here now.
So what recommendations? What comments do you have? But also, what other recommendations would you add?
That's more tricky. First challenge.
No, I understand my invitation a bit better.
No. So I understood the competence question, which is related to the zoning and the NIMBYism, but I think this removes too much complexity of what is happening. I mean, if you look at very centralized countries, it does not appear to me that France is not experiencing housing issues just because of fragmented competences. So I think what has failed is actually if you take a purely regulatory or legal approach to land use. In Austria, we have several regions that try to write up new land use and zoning laws every other year to force the land banking units to sell their land or so. It simply does not work. So I think what works, or what Austria also shows, is that you need to give incentives. If it's the local level who decides, they need to have the incentives. So tax incentives are a very big issue. And actually right now also there is some movement actually that says the incentives to build or to zone are too strong in Austria. I don't share this view, but apparently it is successful. And if you look to the US discussion that communities just have no interest to attract people who live there, they have an incentive to attract businesses for tax reasons, but not people to live there. There are some incentives in Austria, and so you need to get the incentives right, no matter which level of government is responsible. Land value tax also one of the levers I think that you should consider. Also related to shifting from transaction to recurring taxes, I don't know, but there are some interesting studies from Germany which actually show that transaction taxes actually dampen price appreciation. So that it's from IFO Institute. So they look at Grunderwerbsteuer in the different states, and they find actually that this is really a transaction tax in the literal sense of the word. So it removes those transactions which are very quick and in a speculative way, you could say. So I'm in favor in general of the direction, but completely abolishing transaction taxes is maybe a bit too far. And maybe a small challenge also for you, because you were very keen on the financialization of the housing sector, and this poses a problem. I don't know if this is common knowledge, but most or some of the very large non-profit or limited profit housing associations are owned by banks or large insurances. We could discuss now why they're holding this asset in their portfolio or so, but simply getting the financial industry or this sector into the housing market does not seem to be a problem in every case. So I think we should not paint a too black or white picture on the financialization of the housing segment. So yeah, that's it.
Can we ask maybe Stefan? Obviously, from the European Commission, it's very difficult to comment on issues like rent regulation or land policy. It's clearly a national dimension. But be happy to have your perspective. Also, maybe you think of other policies at EU level.
It's actually
promote purposeful investment. Is it working?
Yeah. It's actually not only a national. We in the Commission, we provide country-specific recommendations, and actually recommendations pertaining to zoning and so on are part of that. So we cannot force countries, but we give recommendations, and then a lot of financial incentives depend on those recommendations. So it has actually an impact what the will forming at European level, though it's very slow. So, I mean, let me start by criticizing what you said in the beginning. I talk to a lot of macroprudential people, and I have less confidence in that our competence is what will stop a systemic slump. It's simply there is no construction sector to slump. There is no building. So construction activity cannot decline very much because of this. So there will be not a big macroeconomic effect. That is what's happening right now. It's rather we have this problem that demographically, I mean, the impact from interest rates will fade, and demographically over the next 10 years, we will reach peak city. So what we have an issue right now that ever more people trying to be in the surroundings of the big city, and we really need to work on making more land available to those people. And this is really a question of two aspects that I find underused in the OECD study. One is urban transport. So Dublin is the best example of how you should not do it. For instance, you cannot afford to live in the city. Where you can afford to live, you cannot access the city, right? Vienna or Madrid are good examples of how you should do it, because they allow suburbs to integrate well with the city. So it's a very important policy lever is actually urban transport, and it has been underused and uninvested in over the past 15 years across most of Europe. So it's a very important lever. Another important lever in relation to that is brownfield conversion. We already are successful in the big cities to convert these big industrial areas and rail yards in the center. But the big regulatory challenge right now is the integrating the brownfields from the suburbs that have been built from the 60s to the 80s. All the boomers that live there. And it's very hard to then densify them because you have one that is super healthy, will stay there for until 2040. Another one is already in care. Another one has already moved out. Another one has died. But all these places are very close together. It's a dying neighborhood in a sense. You have a lot of population pressure. In regulatory terms, how do you get those people to sell? Or how it's very hard to lump those purchases together. It's much easier to convert an industrial estate than those suburbs. But those suburbs are the big land resource that we have. So this is the big regulatory challenge that we face. So that's on the one side. On the other side, so construction. Competition is important for construction. I'm with you on this, and it's important with the different models. But the biggest change in house price that we observe is not the price of the construction; it's the price of the land. And land, as we economists call it, is a non-produced, non-financial assets. Competition doesn't give you more land. It's regulation that does. Land land is the origin of all property rights. It's a state-given thing. So it's very hard to create more land. These brownfield conversions are hard. What's easier is actually to have the right tax incentives such that you do something with the land, as you pointed out before. This is quite important. And that brings me back to the recurrent taxation. So I know the IFO study, let's say, working with transaction taxes and recurrent taxes firsthand and even writing laws has convinced me that transaction taxes, it's good to have a small one, but a big one doesn't help. And you're helping incumbents again. And the second is recurrent taxation is a very important tool to get those rents, to extract those rents back from the people who win from the housing market. The difference between Europe and the US is that in Europe we have a much higher price-to-income ratio. In US there is enough land available in these big cities. Here is not. So you have to get to those, you have to find taxation mechanisms that incentivize the supply and the reopening of land for use by others that need it more. And split rate taxation is a great tool. Why? Because you can only have high levels of taxation if you have fair cadastral values. And it's much easier to make fair land cadastral values than the whole real estate. So it's very hard to price mixed-use building. It's very easy to price the land beneath it. So land value taxation with proper allowances for primary residences and for job would actually be a good tool. But and that's why I'll close now, is the political economy of that is very hard. So in Europe, in contrast to the rest of the OECD, our household wealth is concentrated in housing. In the US, they have pension funds. We don't have this kind of stuff here. People don't even trust deposits. All the wealth is content of the median voter is concentrated in housing. It's actually far easier to tax Vonovia. It's very hard to tax people. So people that vote. So that's a bit the issue. The political is very hard. Austria is a good example for this. It's very hard to increase taxation to a level where it would matter, because precisely those demographic groups that represent the most important voting groups are also the ones that hold the most housing wealth, which is again an issue with the boomers in a sense.
Just sorry, one reaction there. Indeed, a lot of these recommendations they go out to member states in the country-specific recommendations as part of the macroeconomic surveillance, but no strict legal competence at the moment. But where the Commission does have legal competence, obviously you mentioned earlier, is competition policy, also VAT, you just mentioned tax. Are there measures that could be taken at EU level in those fields to promote purposeful investment and this competition that has been described by Bernd? So to having a stronger limited profit sector, for instance?
I mean, one important aspect is we always need to review state aid rules. It's a very, very tough field, because if you give too much state aid to certain endowments, then you achieve the opposite effect, right? You might come to an effect like in the Netherlands where there's not enough competition. So it is, in a sense, important to always review the rules, and we will always be behind the curve because it's so complex. So there is a role for the Commission on this one. And the other important role is a much more impactful role that we have right now is the Energy of Buildings Directive. Buildings Energy Efficiency Directive, which actually increases construction costs and affects construction costs a lot. Now, the interaction of this one, of the energy renovation with these brownfield conversions that I talked about, this is a very important aspect. And this is really where city regulation and European regulation have to work hand in hand. So we need constant evaluation of those. And so a lot of jobs for housing economists.
That's a good news. Just actually referring to this green question from the OECD, and very often we hear this argument mentioned that we have an increase in the asset value after energy refurbishment, but we must keep in mind what we're focusing very much is the limited profit rental sector or the social rental sector in many countries. There's no direct gain from having an increase in the asset value. And indeed, I think a lot of our discussion today, it's also focusing a lot on the ownership sector, while we recognise that home ownership is becoming out of reach for more and more Europeans, particularly the new generation. So just a point to keep in mind, if anybody would want to comment. But Julie, please.
I'd like to make a related comment about the problems of asset-based welfare. Asset-based welfare. So asset-based welfare, where your future security and your affordability in post-retirement age or whatever that be dependent on your housing assets, outright housing costs have been paid. Of course, for a significant proportion of young people, they don't see that as their future. So having an adequate alternative is really key. We've also got a number of countervailing policies that are, for example, ageing in place, which are actually blocking the flow of those larger family homes that, and to some degree, we're actually, economising on our aged care, but we're compromising on the future of families. So perhaps that taboo area needs to be discussed. If we had adequate, good quality alternatives for older couples and singles to move on to, then they might be willing to leave the family home. But if they're frightened of it and it means exploitation or loss of the inheritance, God forbid, they're not willing to leave the family home. So some work in Australia has been done on that because we have a terrible problem with this in terms of lack of good quality options for older people. The other area that we haven't talked about at all today is the precariousness of incomes in the labour market. We haven't talked about the gig economy. We haven't talked about the implications that has for a precarious income and the capacity to save in an unregulated rental market to be able to afford the deposit gap for home ownership. So this precariousness is really having an impact on access to adequate housing. And I would also like to see more focus statistically by the agencies able and resourced to do this work is on access to more the access, who has access to adequate housing and which sorts of households and where are missing out at what times in their lives. We need more focus on that as being a sort of indicator of, if you like, a key performance indicator, and have that as more central. And I don't think it would be a big step to take, the 7 dimensions of what adequate housing is and to use that as a sort of index to guide, achievement of the social charter. But so we're more focused on designing housing systems that we need rather than, getting hooked and coping with the consequences of badly designed housing systems as they are. We are too much mopping up the mess and not enough and tinkering around the edges, and we need to have a more focus on the performance we want rather than those other things.
We have a comment, and then maybe perhaps afterwards, if there's another comment from the panel, but then if there are also questions or comments from the participants that are here in the room, I think we could.
Maybe just one quick comment before I leave it to Bernd, because my question was actually, I mean, we squared the circle a bit by asking Bernd how they manage basically to have higher energy efficiency standards in this private market, in this limited profit market. But just one final point on this, the swapping of homes basically between the taboo question of how to allocate the idle space basically that is there. So all the people that don't need the 150 square meters and that kind of there might be a way actually to make space for families to live there and that they swap homes. And I think one of the incentives, financial incentives that Stefan mentioned could be also this property taxation. Because swapping, getting rid of, the transaction cost is actually a big hindrance to leaving your home and buying another one. It's a big chunk of the transaction that you're undertaking when you move. So recurrent property taxation would help residential mobility a lot and could also, by doing so, relieve pressure on prices more generally. But also for this specific issue, it's important. And on this property taxation, I mean, we should not forget that, it's an important discussion, but housing or the home can also be a financial asset. It's a financial asset and a consumption good at the same time. And as a financial asset, the imputed rent, basically the rent that you don't pay, is actually dividend from an economist point of view. And we call this imputed rents. And these imputed rents, they are part of the CPI, so of the consumption basket in many countries. And Eurostat is working on this for like 10, 15 years, I think. They try to include imputed rents in the CPI. And I think this would help a lot, but they struggle to do so. So the raising awareness for the fact that homeowners benefit from a imputed rent, which is kind of a dividend, which is not taxed, and which is the raison d'être for the mortgage interest relief. So we are in a situation where countries have come up with this mortgage interest relief to help mortgage owners basically to cope with costs, but the costs that they don't have because they are not taxed actually for the dividend or for owning the home. So it's actually a third best situation where you have a mortgage interest relief. The first best situation where would be to tax the imputed rents and to help those who actually don't own it because it's still a mortgage that is on the house with mortgage interest relief. The second best solution would just to get rid of the mortgage interest relief altogether. So this property taxation, recurrent property taxation, and imputed rents discussion, I think it's a perfect example of the political economy headwinds that policymakers face. So I think most economists would agree that it's a low-hanging fruit, but it's actually not because of the political economy headwinds. That was just a summary of this discussion between transaction costs and property taxation. And now, something I was always wondering, we were actually hunting down this data that you mentioned, that social housing energy efficiency labels are higher on average than in the private market. We couldn't find this back then when we wrote our first report. But I'm wondering how come? Is this regulated in a sense that if you are under the roof of the GBV, do you have standards that you have to fulfill which lead to higher energy efficiency in the buildings? Or is it just the social purpose kind of environment, which could be part of the story? So I think Bernd is the best place to answer this.
Thank you for the question. It has two sides. The one side is this is only for the rental stock. We have under management as well an ownership stock. In this ownership stock, we are not at the 90 or 96%. On the rental stock, we are in this level. So home ownership, it's a question of motivation. If the household has to take his an extra money to do it, it's not easy to convince them. So, and in the rental stock, the Austrian regulation, you have a special financial circuit. The instrument of the company itself has a certain income for new construction, and each house, a part of the rent is dedicated to renovation. And this, the managing company has to use it for this purpose, and so he is not only making maintenance but as well renovation and modernization, and this is part of. And additional, but this is open for everybody, not only for GBV. There are subsidies, and the subsidies. This is for home ownership for any landlord. You have subsidies, but the main purpose, the main reason is that you have a certain capital dedicated income. The rent in the
So the gap that Sorcha mentioned comes from renovation rather than a gap in new construction.
in
When it
new
comes to
construction,
is it,
we don't count new construction because after the 80s, you could say it's a bit different because as we are very decentralized in all the Länder, it's a different regulation. But since 1980, you can say that the the building law has forced a quality which is best standard. It's now a bit stronger than in the 1980s, but already in the 80s it was very good. And the standard before was partly in the 60s was a disaster. And all these houses who were a disaster, under brackets, are renovated out of this fund. And these are the houses who were out of the repayment period, which ends after 30 or 35 years. And so they had an income of €4 per square meter, and half of it is dedicated for modernization and renovation, and half of it is dedicated for the company for new investment. This it's a very simple story.
so for new construction, you're not
Not overfulfilling, but there is no need. The regulation just now, it's on top. It would be ridiculous. It would be consume more gray energy to do it than you get back on energy on less consumption. Just a few words on the discussion in general. There was the word of deregulation. I think following Matsukato, perhaps deregulation is a good way, but deregulation forces active economic politics. And this is by land policy. If you buy land as a public sector, and you, as you said, then you give it for, might be for housing, might be for other purposes, but you dedicate it with rules. So you can call this regulation if you want, but this is active politics, and regulation is sometimes just hindering. But I learned one day in Boston, in MIT, they told us if you look for a land, because the US is always called the country without regulations, one of the high partners of the municipality said, if you don't want regulations, you should go to another country. That is not, we need regulations to keep society going. So regulation itself is not the problem. To financialization, I think both are right. It's a problem, the financialization, and it's we have to mention that the banking sector and the insurance company sector has assets, but these assets, this comes out of an Austrian culture, and I hope this culture will stay alive, that the big institutional positions, not always investors, but as well industries, the big institutional groups had a certain commitment that everybody should live in a decent way. And out of this, there's a tradition in these institutions to hold these assets. But I think it's, I know the situation a bit out of my personal background. I think it's not bad that it's regulated in the law. Otherwise, they would forget, perhaps. So I think financialization if you mean if it's connected with trading, is a disaster, and in the other way. And to home ownership, just a small remark out of the Austrian empirical situation. Isn't home ownership fueling rental market speculation, maximization in the long run? Out of those home ownerships who were in a romantic way posed to be the asset that shouldn't be taxed if you are old, but it's your insurance for the for later stages when you are in pension. And 50% of these houses out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s are rental homes now. And they have no rent regulation in the special case of Austria, so they are at the highest rent niveau. So home ownership is the beginning of rental housing. But without regulation in general. So you should think about home ownership as well under this aspect. Otherwise, you lose an important thing. And but changing property rights and intervene in property rights by taxes or anything else is an easy task. There's just a political discussion in Austria, and the political party trying to bring the recommendations of the OECD in the political discussion. They don't say that it's from the OECD. They say it's their own idea. I don't understand why, but that is not really good accepted neither by the press nor by the other people. So this is not so easy.
On this panel.
Yeah, hello. My name is Lukas Tockner from the Arbeiterkammer Wien. Sorry, I came a little late, so maybe I missed something from the first part, but I wanted to talk also, add a little on the subject of land use, because from what I understood, you were mainly talking about the mobilization of more land. So it was just on the quantity. But as was also mentioned, land is a non-produced asset and the basis of everything, at least in housing. So I would like to say that you should also talk about the quality. So you should, we from the Arbeiterkammer advocate land being put to the market at a below market price, and you could have it by a lot of ways. For example, if you already have public ownership of land, then usually if they sell it or if they rent it out for construction, someone comes and says this is a betrayal of the taxpayer because you could have earned more money by selling it at a market rate. But that's the wrong approach, I would say. Or at least you should sell, if you sell it, sell a part of it below the market rate to enable purposeful housing investment, as I think you called it this afternoon. Then another measure you could use would maybe build, if you have a problem with private land banking, why not open a public land bank? So for example, in Vienna, maybe some of you know it, you have the Wohn for Wien. So this is more or less a public land bank which continuously buys and sells property, but always with the aim to achieve a certain average price, which is way below market prices. And if they sell land, this land bank, this land fund, it is always used for subsidized construction. And then a third point, so you could also, if you zone by a zoning, if you zone up a plot, maybe you could also, at least part of it, put a fixed price on it, which is below market rate, also with the aim to enable purposeful investment.
There was one in front and then over here.
Thank you. I'm Christoph Schemmer from the Austrian Institute of Spatial Planning. I'm an urban planner. I have some experience with several cities in Austria and Europe. So I would stress that it is essential to keep up social housing or non-profit housing, whatever it is, with regulatory measures for land value, limiting the land price development. And I think we have a good example in Vienna. We have introduced a zoning law that guarantees for larger developments a 50% share for social housing in Vienna. This is an innovative measure introduced 2018, and it has just sprung up in its impact, especially for large inner city developments like old railway stations where you put in 10,000 units. And the seller is the railway company. They are obliged to sell at market price. But if you have this regulation, then 50% of the house prices can be built on land for subsidized housing, which is an enormous impact for larger developments.
It's even 2/3.
Even up to 2/3. And I think that's a regulation that could be really thought about in other areas with high development pressure and high land prices. And I think it's very fair. The other issue is the enormous amount of unused zoned in land for building, which is just serving speculative or individual property value. I think there should be substantial taxation on unused land, which is unused for several years. The problem is that we have a land use policy in Austria and the tradition which produced super amounts of unused zoned in land. And so all these owners, of course, profited from the enormous increase of land values the last 10 years. I think it would be fair enough to give them a clear incentive that if they want to keep it as land for building purposes, they should have some taxation in the meanwhile. So 5 or 10 years at least from the zoning term beginning, then this taxation should set in. Some regulations in Austria were introduced, but they were not effective so far. So this is really complicated matter. And the third complicated matter, of course, is the greening of things. That you mentioned that there is no incentive for the tenant, for the renter, to invest in improvement of the energy situation in the house. Oh, I'm sorry. It's for the owner. For the owner, there's no incentive. It's for the tenant to receive the benefit of having less energy costs in the end. So this is very complicated, how to bring these two settings together in a regulatory framework that can share the incentive between tenants and the owner in a fair way. And that goes into tenant rental right, energy right, and other issues. I think that's a very big issue. Thank you.
We have another comment, and then I would ask each of the panelists. One here in front, the gentleman later, then the lady there, and then one more. So 3 more, and then I would ask the panelists, as we are running out of time, just to like really one point on how you think the conversation should continue and one priority.
Yeah, thanks to SHAPE for holding this event and inviting me to it. I'm also Spina. I work in Ireland for a small housing association, which is in a rural area of Ireland in West Cork. It's very interesting. I noticed that Ireland was not actually included in the survey, but the problems that we face are actually quite similar, but probably worse, because our house prices are not going down, our house prices are going up. And at the same time as house prices are going up, the population is increasing. The population is increasing because there's a lot of migration now to Ireland, and there's a lot of holiday home purchasing because Ireland is considered an ideal place. Now, the effect of this is that the houses that would normally have come on the market are being snapped up, usually by buyers that are not local. So it's creating a problem for local people that young people or even middle-aged people can't move out of their family homes. That's one problem. On the other hand, older people can't move out because they have nowhere to move into. So if an older couple with a family house wants to move, they have nowhere to move to. They're sitting in a large house. There is no place that they can downsize to. Now you could say the problem here is one of supply. Yes, it is, but it's one of affordability as well. At the moment, it's not only low-income people who have no access to housing, it's middle-income people that have no access to housing as well. Increasingly, very few people have access to housing. If you look at the market in Ireland, 500,000 would be a normal price for a 3-bedroom home. What people can actually come up with that income locally? Very few indeed. Now, it's a question of supply and a question of affordability, and a question of models that will actually deliver this. There are no clear-cut answers, and I think that's why it's become such a political issue and why it's actually threatening to make a major political change in Ireland, where parties are offering the world. Whether they can deliver it or not, we don't know. But this is what we're coming to. Really, yes, the problem is great, and in some areas it's increasing. The solutions are not simple. My own feeling is social housing associations are needed of all sorts to be active and to actually provide and develop methods of developing housing. There is land available, both private and public, but it's not being made available for the purposes of it. There is finance, but it's not being made available to the extent that it should in order to solve the problem. For instance, only large associations have access to private finance. Smaller associations do not have access. They decide, the financial institutions decide that these organizations are not creditworthy, so they won't lend to them. So they can't get land, they can't get housing, they can't actually participate in the solution to the problem, really. I think support of social housing associations at every level, something like a financial guarantee from the Commission for small associations that would actually allow smaller associations to develop a diversity of projects would be excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lady over here, and the last gentleman there.
Well, thank you, everybody, and all the panelists, and everybody who participated in organizing this event. It was quite interesting. I wanted to ask Michael. Oh, yes, my name's Bea. I'm an urban planner from California, trained at UC Berkeley, researcher there for a few years, and am now living and working in Vienna to try to understand the model and translate it to Los Angeles. Yeah. And we actually also in Los Angeles have a transfer tax on expensive property, and it is expected to raise $800 million a year in perpetuity and have a dampening effect on private property. So, yeah, maybe it's all dependent on the region, right? So I wanted to ask Michael about your results, your study. Thank you so much. It's a question I've been wondering since my time here. What is the impact of the Genossenschaft system and the limited profit housing sector on the private market? And 50% is a little intimidating of a number. And I do appreciate, though, your comment on that it's not, it's each step you get to it, you are supporting households to become housing secure. So that's a good, and it's also a good North Star for maybe all the cities in the world. And I'm wondering about the effect of your study in Vienna. What does it look like to have this North Star of 50% decommodified housing in the city? And I'm wondering what the conversations look like and here in Vienna, and does it cause tension? Is it exciting? Are you close? Yeah.
Franz Nauschnig, worked for Austrian Central Bank. My question is financing for social housing. Shouldn't we make available cheap financing for social housing, because we have a lot of investment needs? One stuff is state guarantees at the national level. A state guarantee is something like the Austrian ASFINAG model, where the state guarantees for the debt, and so you get cheap financing for social housing companies. A second step would be at the euro area level. For example, the euro system, we had during the crisis, we had the so-called DLTOs, targeted long-term refinancing operations. We could have targeted long-term refinancing operations at low interest rates for social housing. For example, zero interest rate for social housing. We had very low interest rates for banks who increased their loan ratios during the crisis, and we could do it again if we have a recession. We could come out of a recession doing this. Thank you.
So, throw it back to the panel for your final comments. Okay, wait for your reactions and the way forward. Do you want to?
Maybe just to avoid a misunderstanding, I mean, the OECD is not against regulation. I mean, not always. Especially me, but I also speak for the OECD. So when I discussed regulation, it was more a question of the competency and the level of government where actually the responsibility sits. So we are completely in favor of inclusionary zoning and making brownfield and greenfield available, and also enforcing it by regulation. But the question is who decides and who has the competency. And I think it should not be too local. It should not be on a municipal or even smaller level. It should be on the metropolitan level. So that is the key issue. And it should not be scattered around across levels of government and institutions. So it should be streamlined, and the regulation should encompass the utility of all citizens there, not only the incumbents. So that's important. And that's something. And then there was another issue. Yeah, the one size fits it all. I think that I mentioned in my talk. It's actually quite revealing what you mentioned from California. So I think the copy pasting, the 50% threshold, you would probably not achieve this in Los Angeles or in San Francisco. But it's interesting to see what a cultural shock it seems to be for you to listen to that. And I think this is kind of revealing. I think we can learn a lot from countries' experiences, but there's a limit to this. And as I said, I think you cannot build the Austrian model from scratch. I think it's important to understand the Austrian model and how it works and why it works, and to take pieces of it and maybe to bring it to other countries. But there are limits to this implementation in other countries, I would say. And there was another issue I forgot, but I think we are running out of time anyway. So
I'll be as quick as I can, but obviously any regulation or law that affects the housing market should be assessed for its impact on access to adequate housing. So if we're going to fiddle with real estate investment trusts, fiddle with taxation of capital gains, fiddle with negative gearing, they should all be assessed for how do they improve those key performance indicators of our housing system. So we have to make our lead financial regulators realise that they have a core role in actually implementing housing policy. They're currently doing housing policy their own way. And they need to be called to account for the impact they have on people's housing choices and options and costs. They're having a huge impact, and that needs to be articulated and put on the table. So we need our financial regulators, when they're sitting around the table and looking at the social and economic impact of what they do, also consider what will this do for the housing options and impacts at the toppest level. The really important point that was made about the need for national and local cooperation. So mechanisms for that are there and provided for good examples in Housing 2030. One we haven't mentioned is the way in which national level statistical agencies and local level landholders can work more cooperatively together, like they do, for example, in Scotland with the housing demand need assessments. That model, which they're very competent at rolling out, incorporating, leads to social housing investment to be placed in segments of the housing market where it's needed. And done in a way which the capable, strong shoulders can transfer necessary capital to the local level. Thirdly, the multiple players who receive public subsidies in the housing system. We know at the moment it's all primarily going to existing owners, of asset owners. We need to have more of an assessment of when you receive a form of public subsidy that you are to deliver a defined social obligation. So at the moment, we provide in Australia more subsidies to our private landlords who deliver no social obligation, around about 3 to 4 billion a year. And we give almost nothing to our social landlords that are operating within very confined operating conditions. That needs to change. So where there's any form of public subsidy, some countries have a law about that. Finland has a law, Denmark has a law, Austria has a law that when you receive public subsidies, you're to deliver a certain operating model. They're not talking about golden toilets and Maseratis, but they're talking about decent standard of housing, you know, where profit maximisation isn't the purpose, where you know, the best, most efficient model for the tenant is front and centre. So some structural. You okay?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and we hope you are. Anyway, that would be my list. Sorry it took so long.
So the last word, Stefan, and maybe the last word.
Okay, thanks for the interesting question. Thinking about it, actually, most of the no one disputes the results in general. So I've not submitted it to a journal yet or so. So much is still coming probably. But most of the questions are, how much does such a system cost? And is it really worth it? Or how does this put pressure on the private market? So no one is actually discussing or questioning the main results, but more a general level policy debate about the system. And actually within Austria, what I've seen, I'm not sure it's related to this study. I would like to think like this, but in general debate about social housing or the role of social housing. Now that prices and rents have increased so much, this kind of insurance that if you have social housing, the overall market rents will not increase so much. This is more visible now. And so it has kind of a peer pressure or benchmarking effect that people see the map, and if you show regionally how large is the share of this here or that there. So there are political discussions where the question is asked, why don't we have more social or non-profit housing in our region? So I think this is maybe the way the results feed back into the broader policy debate, that we give regional level context to it because we compare across regions. And to the man from the National Bank and the question about financing of social housing, of course, you could always ask for more favorable conditions and EIB loans or whatnot, but actually we have the Wohnbauförderung in Austria, and this will play a much bigger role again in the years to come. And so we have an instrument. We just need to give the lender the right incentives to put up enough money to make it actually work. But the instrument is there. We can complicate it and ask for another bank or something, but yeah, maybe this is not necessary. And maybe the way to go further, one last thing, I think economists have to talk a bit more to spatial planners too, because much of the discussion was about land, and land is really central to it. And I think because your comment and also from the man in the back were lower prices, and so we really have to talk about this in detail, because if you disable the price signals, we will not get higher density. Land value taxes, which most economists would subscribe to, will suffer if you do not sell at market price. So this is a complicated discussion, and we should talk more in detail, but land is central.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So, particular to your comment, because it creates such an incumbent effect. The Southern European way of selling land at lower prices is not very good in the long term. Typically, and has proven so in the South. We haven't all the land that has been sold. It doesn't help us now. But that's an issue. I mean, land prices are a key issue. One place where land prices are much cheaper is the US. And the US is also a place where they actually have effective taxation of property prices, which we don't have in most European countries. And if you have an issue with land prices being too high for people to afford, with lots of people with unoccupied land, with holiday homeowners, Airbnb owners, and all this kind of, the typical economist answer is a simple one: tax them, right? Your first 10 square meters are free allowance, which means no renter in Vienna would pay any tax. But the typical people like me who have too much space, I should pay a lot more, right? So that's the key answer, and it's the easiest answer, because it's much easier to change taxation than to improve social housing model in an institution setting, which is important, but it's a slow building process. Taxation can go quickly in principle, but it takes a crisis, typically in a country like Ireland, to change something, and it's a wasted crisis, probably in the Irish case. Finally, on the state guarantees, this is a state aid issue from the European Commission perspective. It's not the role of the Commission to fund social housing, even though we do it in some spearheading projects. It's for the countries, but it's important for us, and we actually have reviewed this in the past, is to check state aid rules such that it can be done by the national countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a bit optimism as last comment to California. The 50% were on the stock, the analysis. If you have, for instance, 50% on the new construction, or even 70% on new construction, there will happen something on the market already, even if you don't have a stock. We can't say economically now how much, but a bit more optimism is possible. So, but I'm not going to make more comments, except for thank you very much for the really good discussion. Everybody had his introduction, but we came now in a real intervention between us, and this is, I think, the important thing. And thank you to the audience that stayed so long here. And yeah, as we from the GBV tried to bring this conference into being, we say thank you to all of you, and yeah, especially you for guiding us through in a so professional way. Thank you, Sorcha.